For millennia, a single name has echoed through history, shaping civilizations, inspiring billions, and sparking endless debate. Jesus. Was he a divine being, a radical prophet, a revolutionary, or merely a man whose story was reshaped by those who came after him? In the sun-baked lands of Judea, around the turning point of what we now call the Common Era, a child was born whose life would utterly redefine the human experience. While the global calendar marks his birth as Year 1 AD, scholars, poring over ancient texts and astronomical clues, suggest a different truth, placing his arrival between 7 BC and 4 BC. This subtle shift immediately plunges us into the heart of the enigma. If even his birth date is uncertain, what else about this pivotal figure remains shrouded in mystery? The very celebration of December 25th, a date now synonymous with festive cheer and spiritual contemplation, finds no concrete backing in historical records, further highlighting how tradition often supplants documented fact. Every facet of his existence, from the miraculous conception to the agonizing crucifixion and the astounding resurrection, has been meticulously picked apart by those who believe and those who question. Why does a figure from 2 millennia ago still command such intense scrutiny? And what does this relentless examination reveal about our own need for meaning? The most cherished narratives of his birth come to us from the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, each offering a distinct yet harmonizing account, weaving a tapestry rich with divine intervention and human vulnerability. Luke provides the most detailed tableau, painting a picture of Mary, a young virgin betrothed to Joseph, a carpenter whose lineage, it was said, traced back to the venerable King David. Imagine the scene: a quiet Nazareth home, an ordinary life poised on the brink of the extraordinary. Then, the celestial messenger, the angel Gabriel, descends, not with a whisper, but with a pronouncement that would shatter Mary's world and reshape the course of destiny itself. She was to conceive, not through earthly means, but through the Holy Spirit, bearing God's own child. Matthew's Gospel, however, subtly shifts the focus, narrating how the angel appeared not to Mary, but to Joseph, assuaging his troubled heart after discovering Mary's inexplicable pregnancy. He was reassured. This was no human transgression, but a divine miracle, a sacred trust. What must it have been like for Joseph, grappling with such an astounding revelation, to accept a truth that defied all natural understanding? Months later, far from the familiar streets of Nazareth, in the bustling town of Bethlehem, Joseph's ancestral home, now teeming with people for a Roman census, Mary gave birth to the Son of God, not in a grand palace, nor a sterile clinic, but, as the Bible recounts, in the humble confines of a stable, surrounded by the quiet breath of animals. This detail, seemingly incidental, resonates deeply, underscoring a theme of humility and accessibility that would define Jesus' life. Yet, even this foundational narrative is not without its layers of complexity and scholarly debate. Many biblical scholars argue that the earliest traditions didn't present Jesus as born divine, but rather attaining that status later through his baptism, or, more commonly, through his death and resurrection. Mark, the earliest of the Gospels, notably omits any account of Jesus' nativity, beginning instead with his adult ministry. Does this suggest a theological evolution in how Jesus' divinity was understood, or simply different narrative priorities among early writers? Furthermore, the very idea of Jesus as an only child, so central to certain Christian traditions, is challenged by these same ancient texts. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew explicitly name 4 brothers: James, Joseph, Simon, and Jude, and mention unnamed sisters. The Romano-Jewish historian Josephus and the Apostle Paul, both near contemporaries, also refer to a brother named James. Could it be that the historical Jesus was part of a larger family, just like any other man of his time? This clashes with the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox doctrines of Mary's perpetual virginity, leading to interpretations that these siblings were either cousins or step-siblings from a prior marriage of Joseph's. This theological debate highlights a profound tension. How do we reconcile historical accounts with deeply held spiritual beliefs? And what happens when those narratives diverge? Before we delve deeper into Jesus' life and actions, we must anchor ourselves in two crucial foundations: the turbulent historical landscape of Roman Judea that was his home, and the complex, often contradictory nature of the very sources that tell his story. Without understanding the volatile world he inhabited, where Roman power clashed with fervent Jewish faith, and without critically examining the narratives that have shaped our perception of him, we risk projecting our own assumptions onto this most enigmatic of figures. What challenges does this inherent subjectivity pose to anyone seeking the historical Jesus? And can we ever truly separate the man from the myth? To understand Jesus, we must first understand his people. Mary and Joseph were Jewish, inheritors of a cultural and religious legacy stretching back over 1,000 years. Their ancestors had emerged from the chaotic ashes of the late Bronze Age collapse, a period of widespread societal disintegration around 1200 BC, to forge a unique identity in the hills of the southern Levant. By the 11th century BC, they had established two powerful kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Under legendary monarchs like King David and his son Solomon, these states expanded their influence from the sparkling Mediterranean coast to the inland waters of the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. They were a formidable regional power, but their true strength and distinctiveness lay not in their military might, but in the powerful, unifying story they told about themselves. A story of a chosen people, bound by a sacred covenant with their one true God. In a world of countless deities and shifting allegiances, what was it about this singular identity that allowed it to endure centuries of turmoil and conquest? The answer lies in a revolutionary theology and a set of deeply ingrained customs that set the Jewish people apart from all their neighbors. At the heart of their faith was a radical idea: monotheism. In an ancient world where polytheism was the universal norm, their belief in a single, all-powerful, unseen God was a profound departure. This faith was not an abstract philosophy. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. The practice of circumcision was a physical sign of their covenant. The honoring of the Sabbath was a weekly reminder of God's creation, and strict dietary laws, such as the refusal to eat pork, created a constant, tangible distinction between them and the Gentile world. All of this religious and cultural life revolved around a single, sacred point on the globe: the great Temple of Jerusalem. It was not merely a place of worship. It was the dwelling place of God on earth, the center of their national identity, and the heart of their universe. How could a people whose entire existence was defined by such exclusive beliefs and practices ever truly assimilate into the empires that would eventually surround them? Their resilience was tested time and time again. The golden age of David and Solomon faded as larger, more aggressive empires rose in the Fertile Crescent. The Jewish kingdoms declined, eventually falling under foreign domination. The most traumatic of these conquests came in the early 6th century BC, when the Neo-Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II, sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the magnificent temple, and dragged the Jewish elite into what became known as the Babylonian captivity. This was more than a military defeat. It was a profound theological crisis that could have shattered their faith. Yet, it was in exile that their identity was sharpened. Decades later, under the more tolerant rule of the Persian Empire, they were allowed to return home and rebuild their temple, inaugurating the Second Temple period that was still underway when Jesus was born. This cycle of destruction, exile, and return forged a powerful narrative of suffering and redemption, instilling a deep-seated suspicion of foreign rulers and a fervent hope for a divinely ordained liberator. What would happen when the most organized, relentless, and powerful empire the world had ever seen arrived at their doorstep? Rome did not conquer Judea in a single, swift campaign. Its shadow fell gradually. After a brief, fiery period of independence in the 2nd century BC, won by a revolt against the Greek Seleucid Empire, Judea was slowly drawn into Rome's ever-expanding orbit. It became a client state, ruled by a local king who was, in reality, a vassal of Rome. The most notable of these was Herod the Great, a man of immense ambition and paranoia who ruled for 3 decades around the time of Jesus' birth. While Herod was a prolific builder, his reign was marked by brutality and a deference to Roman authority that many of his Jewish subjects found intolerable. Following his death, Rome's control became even more direct. In a series of gradual steps, Judea was fully absorbed, Roman garrisons were established, and a Roman prefect, or governor, was installed as the ultimate authority. By 6 AD, the land of David and Solomon was simply another province. How would a people who cherished the memory of their independent kingdom, and who believed they answered only to God, react to being governed by a pagan emperor and his legions? The imposition of Roman rule turned Judea into a cauldron of political and religious unrest. Unlike many other conquered peoples who accepted Roman administration in exchange for peace and prosperity, the Jewish people never truly acquiesced. The relationship was one of constant friction, exacerbated by Roman mismanagement and profound cultural ignorance. Emperors like Tiberius, who reigned for much of Jesus' adult life, and his local administrators frequently inflamed tensions by disrespecting Jewish law and the sanctity of the temple. This volatile environment gave rise to a spectrum of competing factions. There were the Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy, who collaborated with Rome to maintain their power. There were the Essenes, who retreated into the desert to await a final apocalyptic battle. And there were the Zealots, who preached that violent rebellion was the only path to freedom. In a land saturated with prophetic expectation and simmering with revolutionary fervor, what kind of message could possibly cut through the noise and capture the hearts of the people? It was into this charged atmosphere that a new kind of figure emerged, the wandering, charismatic preacher. Non-conforming religious teachers and messianic prophets became a common sight across the Judean countryside, each offering a path to salvation. Many of these figures preached against what they saw as the corrupt temple authorities in Jerusalem, accusing them of colluding with Rome to protect their own privileges at the expense of the common person. They built followings, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, by tapping into the deep well of spiritual hunger and social discontent. Jesus' ministry did not, therefore, arise in a vacuum. He was part of a much larger social and religious phenomenon. His life, his message, and his ultimate fate would be shaped at every turn by this complex and explosive environment. The critical question then becomes, among all these voices crying out in the wilderness, what made the words of a carpenter from Nazareth so uniquely powerful that they would outlast the Roman Empire itself and reshape the spiritual landscape of the world. Having painted a picture of the volatile world Jesus was born into, we must now confront a far more difficult question. How do we actually know anything about him? The bedrock for nearly everything we are told about his life comes from the New Testament, specifically the 4 Gospels attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But these are not simple historical documents dispatched from the scene by objective journalists. They were written between 70 and 110 AD, a full 40 to 80 years after the events they describe. This significant time lag means they are not direct contemporaneous accounts. They are stories told, retold, and finally written down by a second or even third generation of believers. How much of the original message might have been lost, embellished, or reinterpreted in the decades of oral tradition that preceded the first written word. The traditional view holds that the authors were apostles like Matthew and John, or their close companions like Mark and Luke. However, the vast majority of modern scholars believe the Gospels were written anonymously and only later had these prestigious names attached to them to lend them greater authority and credibility. This was a common practice in the ancient world, not necessarily meant to deceive, but to honor a tradition's founder. Furthermore, these texts were composed in sophisticated Greek, not the Aramaic that Jesus and his disciples spoke in the villages of Galilee. This linguistic leap implies that the authors were educated, elite members of the early Christian movement, several steps removed from the rural Aramaic-speaking world of the man himself. What transformations did Jesus' simple, powerful sayings undergo as they were translated, not just into a new language, but into a new cultural and intellectual context? When we examine the Gospels closely, a fascinating literary relationship emerges. Mark, Matthew, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels because they share a similar structure and a great deal of content, often word for word. The prevailing scholarly theory is that Mark was written first, and that both Matthew and Luke used it as a primary source for their own narratives. But they also seem to have drawn from another, now lost source, a collection of Jesus' sayings that scholars have dubbed Q, from the German word Quell, meaning source. The Gospel of John, by contrast, stands apart. Written last, it presents a different chronology, a distinct set of stories, and a much more overtly divine and philosophical Jesus. For this reason, while it is theologically profound, most historians consider it the least historically reliable for reconstructing the life of the man from Nazareth. If the gospel writers were editing, selecting, and arranging their material to fit a specific narrative, can we ever truly separate their theological agenda from the raw data of history? Ironically, the earliest Christian writings we possess are not the Gospels, but the letters of the Apostle Paul, written in the middle of the 1st century, just 2 to 3 decades after Jesus' crucifixion. Yet, while Paul is our closest chronological source, he provides frustratingly little information about the historical Jesus. Paul never met Jesus in the flesh. His conversion was based on a vision of the resurrected Christ. His letters are not biographies, but theological arguments, pastoral advice, and community instructions. He is a witness to the passionate faith of the first Christians, not to the life of the Galilean teacher who inspired it. Why would our earliest Christian author be so seemingly uninterested in the parables, miracles, and earthly ministry of Jesus, focusing instead almost exclusively on the meaning of his death and resurrection? To find external corroboration, we must turn to non-Christian sources, and what we find is both revealing and humbling. The Romano-Jewish historian Josephus, writing near the end of the 1st century, mentions Jesus twice, referring to him as a wise man and teacher who was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and also noting the existence of his brother, James. Roman historians like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, writing in the early 2nd century, also make brief, almost dismissive references to Christus and his followers, the Christians, whose movement they regarded as a troublesome superstition. These fleeting mentions are historically priceless. They confirm that Jesus was a real person who lived and was executed. But they also tell us something else. In his own time, to the wider Roman world, Jesus of Nazareth was an obscure provincial figure whose execution was barely a footnote in the grand annals of the empire. If he made such a small ripple in the official histories of his day, how did his followers manage to unleash a tsunami that would eventually engulf that very empire? The 4 canonical Gospels are, moreover, just a fraction of the Christian texts that circulated in the first few centuries. Dozens of other apocryphal Gospels existed, with names like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, and the Gospel of Philip, each offering a unique and sometimes bizarre portrait of Jesus. These were ultimately excluded from the New Testament when the early Church Fathers, particularly during the reign of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, began the process of canonization, selecting which books they deemed theologically suitable to form the official scripture for a new state religion. Their goal was not historical accuracy. It was to forge a unified doctrine and a stable institution. What alternate versions of Jesus and his message were silenced or lost in this process of creating a single, authorized narrative? Faced with this maze of late, biased, and heavily edited sources, how can a historian possibly hope to find the authentic Jesus? In 1985, a group of American biblical scholars convened the Jesus Seminar in a bold attempt to answer this very question. For years, they meticulously analyzed every saying and deed attributed to Jesus, voting on the probability of its authenticity based on criteria like multiple attestations and historical plausibility. Their conclusions were shocking. They found that only about 18% of the sayings and 16% of the deeds in the canonical Gospels could be confidently attributed to the historical Jesus. While their methods and conclusions remain highly debated, their work starkly illustrates the immense challenge we face. If the bedrock of our knowledge is so uncertain, on what ground can we possibly stand to understand this man? With these profound caveats firmly in mind, that our sources are not biographies but theological proclamations, written decades later by authors with a specific agenda, we can proceed. The quest for the historical Jesus is not about reading a simple story. It's an act of historical archaeology, carefully brushing away centuries of theological sediment to glimpse the faint outline of the man who lies beneath. Where, then, does the discernible story of his public life actually begin? It begins not with Jesus himself, but with another, fiercer voice, crying out from the desert wilderness. Out of the political turmoil and religious formalism of Judea, a new and startling voice emerged. It came not from the hallowed halls of the Jerusalem temple, but from the desolate sun-scorched wilderness along the river Jordan. This was John, son of Zechariah, a figure who seemed torn from the pages of the old prophets. Clad in camel's hair and a leather belt, subsisting on a diet of locusts and wild honey, John the Baptist was a man stripped of all worldly pretense. His message was as raw and uncompromising as his appearance. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. This was not a gentle suggestion. It was an urgent, apocalyptic demand. For the crowds that flocked to him, the day of judgment he preached was not some abstract end of the world. but an imminent, violent upheaval where God himself would intervene to redeem Israel, purify its people, and cast out the unrighteous. To signify this radical turning, John performed a powerful ritual: baptism in the Jordan. This was not the Christian sacrament we know today, but a Jewish rite of purification, a full immersion that symbolized the washing away of sin and a rebirth into a state of readiness for God's coming reign. What was it about this stark message and this simple act that drew so many from their homes and into the wilderness? Into this ferment of expectation walked Jesus. Around the age of 30, he emerged from the quiet obscurity of his life in Nazareth and journeyed south to the Jordan, seeking out this wild prophet. The Gospels state that Jesus accepted John's message and asked to be baptized. This moment is one of the most historically certain events of Jesus' life, yet it is also one of the most theologically complex. Why would the one later proclaimed as the sinless Son of God need to undergo a baptism for the repentance of sins? The Gospel writers themselves seem to grapple with this, with Matthew's account including a protest from John. "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" Jesus' insistence on the act suggests a profound moment of solidarity, of identifying himself with the spiritual crisis of his people, and formally inaugurating his own divine mission. It was here, the Synoptic Gospels declare, that the heavens opened, a spirit like a dove descended, and a voice proclaimed, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." Was this a private revelation for Jesus, a public endorsement for the crowds, or a theological interpretation added by later writers to explain this puzzling event? John's electrifying ministry, however, was destined to be short-lived. His fiery denunciations were not limited to the sins of the common people. He openly condemned the actions of the ruling elite. According to the historian Josephus, John's growing influence alarmed Herod Antipas, the Roman client king of Judea. The final straw was John's public criticism of Antipas's marriage to his niece, Herodias, which violated Jewish law. Seeing a potential political uprising in the making, Antipas had John arrested and imprisoned. Later, he would be executed, gruesomely beheaded to satisfy the whim of his new wife. John's removal from the scene created a critical vacuum. The Gospel of Mark makes a direct link. It is only after John is arrested that Jesus begins his own public ministry in Galilee. This timing is crucial. Was Jesus merely a disciple of John, stepping up to continue his master's work after his death? Or was he about to take that apocalyptic message and transform it into something radically new? Before he could begin, however, the Gospels relate that Jesus was driven into the wilderness to be tested. For 40 days and 40 nights, a period rich with biblical symbolism, echoing Moses on Mount Sinai and Israel's wandering in the desert, he fasted and contemplated his path. It was here, in this state of extreme isolation and deprivation, that he faced a series of profound temptations. The devil, the embodiment of opposition to God's will, challenged him to prove his divinity and choose his path. First, he was tempted to turn stones into bread, to become a Messiah who would solve humanity's material needs. Second, he was offered all the kingdoms of the world if he would only bow to a different power, the temptation to be a political, military Messiah who would liberate Israel by force. Finally, he was challenged to throw himself from the pinnacle of the temple, to become a Messiah of spectacle, compelling belief through cheap miracles. In each case, Jesus refused, quoting scripture and rejecting a path of economic, political, or magical power. While some view this as a literal spiritual battle, it can also be seen as a powerful literary device. an internal struggle where Jesus defined the very nature of his ministry. He would not be the kind of Savior the world expected or even wanted. By rejecting these temptations, what kind of path was he choosing for himself, and where would that unconventional journey first lead him? Jesus did not begin his ministry in the corridors of power in Jerusalem, nor in the desolate wilderness of his temptation. Instead, he returned to the familiar, rolling hills of his home region, Galilee. Unlike the austere Orthodox heartland of Judea to the south, Galilee was a crossroads, a place of fertile land, bustling towns, and a diverse population where Jewish and Gentile cultures mingled. It was here, among the villages and fishing towns dotting the shore of the vast, harp-shaped Sea of Galilee, that he chose to launch his mission. The Gospels state that his first stop was his own hometown of Nazareth. But the reception was not what one might expect. When he preached in the local synagogue, the people who had watched him grow up, who knew him simply as the carpenter's son, rejected him. "A prophet is not without honor," Jesus reportedly said, "except in his own town and in his own home." Driven out, he made his way to Capernaum, a thriving fishing village on the northern shore of the sea, which would become the de facto headquarters for his itinerant ministry. Why would he find a more receptive audience among strangers in a busy port town than among the people who had known him his entire life? It was on the shores of this very sea that the core of his movement began to form. The scene, as painted by Mark and Matthew, is iconic in its simplicity. Jesus sees two brothers, Simon and Andrew, casting their nets into the water. He calls out to them with a phrase that is both an invitation and a command. "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." A little further down the shore, he finds two more brothers, James and John, mending their nets in a boat with their father. He calls them, and they immediately leave their father and their trade to join him. Luke's version adds a dramatic flourish. Jesus, preaching from Simon's boat, instructs the seasoned fisherman to cast his nets one more time after a fruitless night of work. Simon protests, but complies, and is rewarded with a catch so massive it nearly sinks two boats. Overwhelmed by this sign, Simon falls to his knees. In both tellings, the response is immediate and absolute. These men, ordinary laborers, not scholars or priests, abandon everything they have ever known to follow a charismatic but unproven preacher. What was it about Jesus' presence or his message that could inspire such instantaneous, life-altering devotion? The symbolism of fish, water, and fishermen would become a recurring motif throughout the Gospels, representing a mission aimed at gathering people from the chaotic sea of humanity. These first four men were the beginning of a special inner circle that would become known as the 12 disciples, or apostles. The number 12 was no accident. It was a powerful, deliberate echo of the 12 tribes of ancient Israel. By selecting 12, Jesus was making a profound symbolic statement. He was not starting a new religion, but restoring the true people of God. The lists of these 12 apostles in the Synoptic Gospels vary slightly, creating a puzzle for historians. Simon, later renamed Peter, the Rock, James, and John consistently appear as the innermost circle. Figures like Andrew, Philip, Thomas, and Matthew are also mainstays. But the final names on the list sometimes differ, with one disciple called Thaddeus in some Gospels, and Judas, son of James, in another. And of course, there is Judas Iscariot, forever named as the one who would betray him. The inconsistencies suggest the lists were compiled from different oral traditions, yet the very confusion lends a strange kind of authenticity. If later writers were simply inventing the list, why would they create such needless complications for their readers, like having 2 disciples named James and 2 named Judas? With his core group assembled, Jesus began a traveling ministry throughout the towns and villages of Galilee. His strategy appears to have been deliberately grassroots. He seems to have avoided the major, heavily Romanized cities like Sepphoris, a sophisticated administrative center just a few miles from Nazareth, and Tiberias, the new capital Herod Antipas had built on the lakeshore. His focus was on the rural poor, the marginalized, and the downtrodden. This was not a campaign for the elite. It was a movement that bubbled up from below. Matthew's gospel includes a stark instruction to his disciples: take no gold, no silver, no copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, not even a second tunic. They were to live off the charity of those who welcomed them, staying in the homes of worthy people. This radical dependence on community hospitality reinforced his message of an egalitarian kingdom of heaven, where worldly wealth and status were meaningless. This itinerant lifestyle stood in stark contrast to the established religious authorities, who were deeply connected to the wealth and structure of the temple. How did Jesus' own family, who were not part of this wandering band, view this radical departure from the stable life of a village craftsman? Joseph is never mentioned after Jesus' childhood, and Mary appears only fleetingly, at one point seeming to believe he has gone mad. A key and often controversial figure who does appear regularly in the accounts is Mary Magdalene. Mentioned more frequently in the canonical Gospels than many of the apostles, she was a devoted follower from whom Jesus had reportedly cast out 7 demons. In the non-canonical Gospel of Philip, she is referred to as Jesus' companion, a term that has fueled centuries of speculation that she may have been his wife. While this remains entirely unproven, her prominence in the narrative is undeniable, representing the significant role women played within Jesus' movement, a role often downplayed in the patriarchal society of the time and by later church traditions. The presence of Mary Magdalene and other female supporters like Joanna and Susanna, who the Gospel of Luke says provided for the group out of their own means, suggests a community far more inclusive and socially radical than the world around it. What did the inclusion of these women, traveling alongside men in a way that defied conventional norms, signal about the new social order Jesus was preaching? In addition to his radical preaching, a core element of Jesus' growing fame was his reputation as a miracle worker. To a modern audience, steeped in scientific rationalism, the concept of miracles is often the greatest stumbling block in the gospel narratives. But in the ancient world, the line between the natural and the supernatural was porous, and divine intervention was considered a genuine possibility in everyday life. The most telling detail is that even Jesus' staunchest opponents rarely denied that he performed extraordinary deeds. Instead, they furiously debated the source of his power, attributing it to demonic forces rather than the God of Israel. The question for the people of Galilee was not if these things were happening, but why. Was this man a charlatan using dark arts, a holy man blessed by God, or something else entirely? The vast majority of Jesus' miracles were acts of healing. In an era where medical knowledge was rudimentary and often counterproductive, sickness was a constant and terrifying presence. A fever could be a death sentence, blindness or leprosy a one-way ticket to a life of begging and social exclusion. People suffering from conditions we would now recognize as epilepsy or mental illness were often believed to be afflicted by demons. Into this world of pain and fear, Jesus stepped as a figure of profound hope. The Gospels are filled with accounts of him curing the blind, enabling the lame to walk, and casting out demons with a simple word or touch. Perhaps the most stunning example, the absolute peak of this healing power, was the story of the resurrection of Lazarus of Bethany, a man already in his tomb for 4 days. Yet, in historical terms, Jesus was not entirely unique. Josephus writes of an earlier figure, Honi the circle drawer, a holy man famous for his ability to successfully pray for rain during a drought. The Jews of Jesus' day distinguished between charismatics, who could perform wonders by petitioning God, and magicians, who used specific rituals and incantations. If other holy men could perform wonders, what made Jesus' miracles so profoundly different and, to the authorities, so dangerous? The answer lies in how Jesus integrated his miracles directly into his challenge of the established order. They were not just acts of compassion, they were public statements. This is vividly illustrated in the story of him healing a woman in a synagogue on the Sabbath. For 18 years, she had been bent over, unable to stand straight. Jesus healed her, and the leader of the synagogue, incensed, rebuked him not for healing, but for working on the holy day of rest. Jesus' response was a blistering counterattack, accusing his critics of hypocrisy for caring more for their livestock on the Sabbath than for a suffering human being. Here, the miracle becomes a vehicle for a revolutionary theological argument. Human need and compassion are the supreme laws, trumping even the most sacred of religious regulations. By placing human need above established religious law, was Jesus simply offering a new interpretation? Or was he claiming an authority greater than the law itself? Beyond individual healings, the Gospels recount miracles on a far grander scale, where Jesus seems to exhibit control over the very forces of nature. There is the iconic tale of him walking across the water to rescue his disciples from a storm-tossed boat on the Sea of Galilee. There are the stories of him feeding thousands of people with just a handful of loaves and fish. And at a wedding feast in Cana, he is said to have saved the hosts from embarrassment by transforming several large jars of water into fine wine. These nature miracles elevate the narrative beyond a mere healer to someone who wields cosmic authority. Interestingly, the Gospel writers record different reactions to these events. The disciples are left in bewildered awe after he walks on water, but the crowds in the feeding miracles seem to take the astonishing event in stride. This has led some scholars to suggest that these particular stories were elaborated in the decades of oral tradition to emphasize the scale of Jesus' following and the divine scope of his power. Whether literal events or symbolic tales, what message were the Gospel writers trying to convey by depicting a man who could command the wind and multiply bread? Ultimately, the miracles, whether viewed as historical fact or theological metaphor, served a singular purpose. They were the engine of his ministry. They drew the crowds, validated his authority, and served as living parables for his teachings. He didn't just talk about God's love for the outcast. He physically touched and healed the leper. He didn't just speak of a bread of life. He miraculously provided food for the hungry. This reputation as a healer and wonder worker is even alluded to when he is criticized for dining with tax collectors and sinners. His famous reply, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick," perfectly encapsulates how his miraculous deeds and his social message were two sides of the same coin. The power was the proof, but it was a proof that always pointed toward a larger, more radical truth. With a reputation built on these incredible deeds, what revolutionary ideas did Jesus of Nazareth then unleash upon the eager and expectant crowds of Galilee. While his miracles drew the crowds and established his authority, it was Jesus' words that contained the true revolution. His teachings, delivered not in formal lectures but in vivid parables, sharp aphorisms, and confrontational debates, were arguably far more dangerous to the established order than any act of healing. While Mark's gospel emphasizes the deeds, Matthew and Luke place their focus squarely on the message. The most famous distillation of this message is found in Matthew's gospel, in what has become known as the Sermon on the Mount. It begins with a series of blessings, the Beatitudes, that systematically turn the world's values upside down. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he begins, "for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." This is not a political manifesto in the traditional sense. It's a redefinition of power itself, where strength is found in humility and wealth in spiritual poverty. What kind of a society could possibly be built on a foundation so utterly contrary to the Roman ideals of dominance and the temple's hierarchy of purity? Luke's version of this sermon, known as the Sermon on the Plain, is even more stark and socially explosive. Where Matthew speaks of the poor in spirit, Luke's Jesus says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." He doesn't spiritualize the condition. He addresses the physically hungry and the weeping directly. And then he adds a series of chilling woes directed at the comfortable and powerful. "But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry." This isn't just a promise of future reward for the downtrodden. It's a direct warning of a coming reversal for the elites. This theme, that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, echoes throughout his teachings. It's a message that would have been deeply unnerving to the wealthy Sadducees and the Roman authorities, who relied on the existing social structure to maintain control. Was this a promise of a spiritual reordering, or was he actively sowing the seeds of a social revolution? At the heart of all his teachings was a single, powerful, yet enigmatic concept: the kingdom of God, or in Matthew's more Jewish phrasing, the kingdom of heaven. He spoke of it constantly, but what did he actually mean? Biblical scholars have debated this for centuries. For the Jewish people of his time, the term could mean several things: the eternal, transcendent reign of God in the heavens, a future, apocalyptic kingdom on earth where God would finally rule directly, or even the present, limited reality of God's intervention through answered prayers. Jesus seems to invoke all these meanings at different times. At points, he speaks of it as an imminent event that will arrive with cosmic power within their lifetimes. At others, he describes it as a present reality, a seed growing secretly within the world and within the human heart. This ambiguity was likely intentional, creating a dynamic tension between waiting for God's future action and acting now to live out the values of that coming kingdom. How could his followers be expected to build a movement around a central concept that was so deliberately open to interpretation? Perhaps the clearest illustrations of this kingdom's values are found in his parables, short, relatable stories drawn from everyday life that carried a shocking spiritual punch. The parable of the prodigal son, found only in Luke, is a masterpiece of this method. It tells of a younger son who demands his inheritance, squanders it on a life of depravity, and returns home in utter disgrace, ready to beg for a servant's job. But instead of the condemnation he deserves, his father sees him from a distance, runs to him, embraces him, and throws a lavish feast to celebrate his return. The dutiful elder brother, who has worked faithfully his whole life, is justifiably outraged. The Father's response gets to the very heart of Jesus' message about God. We had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. This wasn't just a heartwarming tale. It was a direct assault on the purity-based theology of the temple. It proclaimed a God who actively seeks out and rejoices over the unclean, the sinner, and the outcast, an idea that would have been anathema to the religious establishment. If God's mercy extends so radically to the unrighteous, what then is the purpose of the intricate system of laws and sacrifices they so carefully maintained? Yet, this image of a merciful God is balanced by a demand for a standard of morality so high it seems almost impossible to achieve. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus repeatedly says, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." He takes the established laws of the Old Testament and internalizes them, making the intention as significant as the action. He cites the commandment against murder, then argues that even unchecked anger is a sin worthy of judgment. He takes the law against adultery and declares that looking at a woman with lust is already adultery of the heart. The famous exhortations to turn the other cheek and to love your enemies go far beyond the old law of an eye for an eye, demanding a response to violence and hatred that is completely counterintuitive. This wasn't a relaxation of the law. It was a radical intensification of it, shifting the focus from external observance to the inner landscape of the soul. How can we reconcile this call for near-perfect inner righteousness with the unconditional, almost reckless mercy shown in the parables? Jesus' willingness to challenge the strict application of Jewish law is a constant source of conflict in the Gospels. In one famous incident, the Pharisees criticize his disciples for picking heads of grain to eat on the Sabbath, an act they considered a form of work. Jesus' response cuts to the core of his philosophy. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In that single sentence, he subordinates one of the most sacred pillars of Jewish life to the principle of human need. This reordering of priorities, people over rules, compassion over ritual, is the defining characteristic of his ethical teachings. It's what led many biblical scholars to see him as the leader of a burgeoning social reform movement, one that shared surprising affinities with the cynic philosophers of the Greek world, who also rejected social conventions in favor of a simpler, more natural way of life. By consistently placing human dignity above religious tradition, was Jesus trying to reform Judaism from within, or was he laying the groundwork for a complete break from it? For perhaps 3 years, Jesus had confined his ministry to the familiar landscapes of Galilee, his message a slow-burning fire among the rural poor. But now, the narrative takes a sharp, deliberate turn. The target is no longer a village synagogue. It is Jerusalem, the epicenter of Jewish faith, culture, and power. And the timing is no coincidence. It is the month of Nisan, the time of Passover, the most sacred and politically charged festival in the Jewish calendar. Every year, the city's population would swell with hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, all gathered to celebrate their liberation from slavery in Egypt. The air would be thick with nationalistic pride and fervent messianic expectation. For the Roman authorities, it was a security nightmare, a tinderbox of potential rebellion. For Jesus to choose this exact moment to leave the relative safety of Galilee and walk directly into the heart of his opposition was a monumental and seemingly fatal decision. Was this a pilgrimage of peace, or a calculated final confrontation. His arrival was anything but subtle. The Gospels paint a vivid and dramatic scene. As Jesus approached the city, he sent 2 disciples to find a donkey, a specific instruction that was heavy with prophetic meaning. He entered Jerusalem not on a war horse like a conquering Roman general, but on a humble beast of burden, a direct fulfillment of a prophecy from Zechariah about a gentle, peaceful king. The crowds that had gathered for the festival went into a frenzy. They laid their cloaks on the road before him, a traditional sign of honor for royalty, and waved palm branches, a symbol of Jewish nationalism. They shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." This was not a quiet entry. It was a carefully staged piece of street theater, a public and unmistakable claim to be the Messiah, the long-awaited Son of David. How could the temple priests and Roman soldiers watching this spectacle unfold possibly interpret it as anything other than a direct challenge to their authority? The next day, Jesus took his challenge from the streets and into the sacred heart of the establishment, the temple complex itself. Here, in the outer courts, a bustling economy supported the sacred rituals. Pilgrims had to exchange their Roman coins, which bore the idolatrous image of the emperor, for special temple currency to pay the annual tax. They also purchased doves, lambs, and other animals that had been certified as unblemished for sacrifice. This was a necessary, sanctioned, and highly profitable system overseen by the temple authorities. Jesus, in what must have been a shocking and violent scene, stormed through the court, flipping over the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. He declared, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." This was not just a protest against commercialism. It was a direct accusation of systemic corruption and a physical assault on the economic foundation of the temple priesthood. Was this a spontaneous act of righteous fury, or a calculated strike designed to provoke a final decisive response? This single act sealed his fate. The itinerant preacher from the provinces had been a nuisance, his message of social reversal an irritant. But now he had brought his revolution to the very steps of the temple during its most volatile week. He had publicly claimed to be king and had physically disrupted the sacred economy. He was no longer just a heretic, he was a threat to public order. The Gospel of Mark adds another layer, having Jesus predict of the magnificent temple, "There will not be left here one stone upon another." To the authorities, this would have sounded like a seditious threat of destruction. For the priestly class led by the high priest, Caiaphas, for the Roman client ruler, Herod Antipas, and for the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, their separate interests now converged on a single point. This man had to be eliminated. The Galilean experiment was over. The Jerusalem endgame had begun. Faced with this direct assault on their power and the stability of the city, how would the authorities orchestrate the removal of a man who now commanded the adoration of the volatile Passover crowds? The authorities in Jerusalem faced a critical problem. Arresting Jesus in the open, surrounded by the adoring and volatile Passover crowds, would risk a full-blown riot. They needed to take him quietly, at night, away from the public eye. To do that, they needed an insider, someone who could lead them to him in a private moment. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke state that they found their answer in one of Jesus' own 12 apostles, Judas Iscariot. They allege that Judas went to the chief priests and offered to deliver Jesus to them in exchange for money. Matthew's account adds the iconic, damning detail. The price was 30 pieces of silver, the same amount specified in the Old Testament as compensation for a gored slave. This detail paints the betrayal not just as an act of treachery, but as a sordid, cheap transaction that reduced the Son of Man to the value of damaged property. What could possibly motivate a man who had walked with Jesus for years, heard his teachings, and witnessed his miracles, to commit such an ultimate act of betrayal for a handful of coins? While this conspiracy was taking shape in the shadows, Jesus gathered his 12 disciples in an upper room in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover meal. The atmosphere must have been thick with foreboding. This was not a normal feast. As they were eating, Jesus dropped a bombshell that shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment. "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The reaction was one of chaos and disbelief. The Gospels portray the disciples in a state of panicked denial, each asking, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?" Luke's account adds a layer of pathetic irony, noting that even after this chilling announcement, they began to argue among themselves about which of them was the greatest. In this sacred, final hour, their human egos and insecurities were still on full display, a stark illustration of how little they truly understood the gravity of what was unfolding. If his closest followers were still preoccupied with their own status at a time like this, had they truly grasped any of his message about humility and service? It was in the midst of this tension and confusion that Jesus performed an act that would become the central ritual of the new faith. He took a loaf of unleavened bread, gave thanks to God, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup of wine, gave thanks, and passed it around the table. "Drink from it, all of you," he commanded. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." In this single moment, Jesus radically reinterpreted the Passover. The meal would no longer be about remembering the blood of a lamb that saved the ancient Israelites from the angel of death in Egypt. Now, it would be about his own body and his own blood, willingly offered as a sacrifice to establish a new covenant between God and humanity. He was framing his impending death not as a tragic defeat, but as a deliberate, redemptive act. Did the disciples, as they ate the bread and drank the wine, have any inkling that they were participating in the foundation of a new world religion? After the supper, Jesus led his disciples out of the city across the Kidron Valley to a grove of olive trees on the Mount of Olives, a place called Gethsemane. Here, the divine certainty he displayed in the upper room gave way to a profoundly human agony. He took his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, and confessed, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He asked them to simply stay awake and keep watch with him, then went a little further to pray. His prayer was not a stoic acceptance of fate, but a raw, desperate plea. "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." This is perhaps the most vulnerable moment of Jesus' life recorded in the Gospels, a man wrestling in anguish with the terrible fate that awaited him. While he was locked in this spiritual battle, his disciples failed him utterly. Overcome by exhaustion and wine, they fell asleep. He returned to find them sleeping, his isolation now absolute. If even his most trusted friends could not stand with him in his darkest hour, what did that reveal about the solitary nature of his ultimate sacrifice? The quiet of the garden was then shattered by the flicker of torches and the clang of weapons. A detachment of temple guards and Roman soldiers arrived, led by Judas. The prearranged signal was not an accusation, but a gesture of intimacy corrupted into an act of betrayal. Judas walked up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. This act, a common greeting between a master and his disciple, was the sign that identified Jesus to the guards. Jesus' response was one of weary resignation. "Friend, do what you came for." He offered no resistance as the guards seized him. His disciples, finally shocked into action, made a brief, futile attempt to fight before scattering into the night, abandoning him completely. The conspiracy had succeeded. The prophet who had entered Jerusalem to the cheers of thousands was now a lone prisoner, bound and dragged away in the darkness. He was now in the hands of the very men whose authority he had so publicly and profoundly challenged. What kind of trial, what form of justice could he possibly expect from a court that had already sealed his condemnation? In the dead of night, Jesus was dragged before an emergency session of the Sanhedrin, the high court of Jewish law, presided over by the high priest, Joseph Caiaphas. This was not a trial in any modern sense. It was a pre-condemnation hearing. The outcome was already decided. The only purpose was to manufacture a charge that would stick. The Gospels describe a chaotic scene, with the court bringing in a series of false witnesses whose testimonies contradicted each other. Finally, they found two who claimed to have heard Jesus say he would destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. This was a capital offense, a direct threat to the heart of the nation. Throughout the accusations, Jesus remained silent, a silent refusal to grant the proceedings any legitimacy. Exasperated, Caiaphas finally confronted him directly, demanding under oath, "Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus' reply was cryptic, yet electrifying. "You have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." For Caiaphas, this was the confession he needed. He tore his robes in a theatrical display of outrage and declared it blasphemy, a crime punishable by death. What was the real crime in Caiaphas's eyes? The religious charge of blasphemy, or the political threat of a man who claimed an authority higher than the temple and a kingdom more powerful than Rome? Under Roman law, however, the Sanhedrin did not have the authority to carry out a death sentence. For that, they needed the ratification of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. So, as dawn broke, Jesus was bound and taken to the governor's palace. The charge of blasphemy would mean nothing to a Roman official, so they reframed their accusation. They presented Jesus to Pilate not as a religious heretic, but as a political insurrectionist, a man who claimed to be King of the Jews, a clear act of sedition against the emperor. The Gospels now present a fascinating and deeply problematic drama. They depict Pilate as a reluctant executioner, a world-weary administrator who interviews Jesus and finds him largely innocent of any real crime. "Are you the King of the Jews?" Pilate asks, almost mockingly. Jesus' famous reply, "My kingdom is not of this world," seems to convince Pilate that this man is a harmless philosopher, not a revolutionary. The narrative then shifts the blame for Jesus' death away from the Roman governor and squarely onto the Jewish people. Pilate, according to the Gospels, offers the Passover crowd a choice. He will release one prisoner, as was the custom, either Jesus or a notorious insurrectionist named Barabbas. The crowd, incited by the chief priests, screams for the release of Barabbas and roars, "Crucify him," when asked what to do with Jesus. Why would the same crowds that hailed Jesus as a king just days earlier now be baying for his blood? This depiction of Pilate is one of the most historically contested parts of the entire story. Our independent historical sources, like the writings of Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, paint a picture of a ruthless, inflexible, and brutal governor, a man who had no qualms about using violence to put down even the slightest hint of Jewish unrest. The idea that he would bend to the will of a mob out of a sense of justice is almost unthinkable. A more plausible historical explanation lies in the context in which the Gospels were written. Decades after Jesus' death, the early Christian church, now composed mostly of non-Jews, Gentiles, was trying to survive and grow within the Roman Empire. There had been several violent Jewish revolts against Rome between 66 and 135 AD, leading to immense bloodshed and a pervasive anti-Jewish sentiment throughout the empire. For the early Christians, it was a matter of strategic survival to distinguish themselves from the rebellious Jews and present their faith as non-political and loyal to Rome. By portraying the Roman governor as a sympathetic figure and the Jewish authorities and populace as the true villains, the gospel writers were creating a politically expedient narrative. This decision, however, would have catastrophic consequences, creating a theological justification for centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. How did this strategic rewriting of history to absolve the Romans shape the future relationship between Christianity and Judaism for the next 2,000 years? Having theatrically washed his hands of the matter, Pilate handed Jesus over to his soldiers. What followed was an exercise in pure, sadistic cruelty. The soldiers stripped him, placed a scarlet robe on him, twisted together a crown of thorns and jammed it onto his head, and put a staff in his hand as a mock scepter. They knelt before him in jeering homage, hailing him as King of the Jews, then spat on him and beat him on the head with the staff. This was more than just random brutality. It was a systematic humiliation, a political statement designed to show what Rome does to provincial upstarts who dare to claim the title of king. Finally, scourged to the point of collapse, Jesus was forced to carry his own crossbeam through the streets of Jerusalem, along a path now known as the Via Dolorosa, to a place of execution outside the city walls. The destination was a grim, skull-shaped hill called Golgotha. Here, alongside two other condemned criminals, he was nailed to the cross. According to Mark, at 3 p.m, after hours of unimaginable agony, Jesus cried out in his native Aramaic, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" This cry of utter desolation, a quote from the Psalms, has haunted theologians for centuries. Was it a moment of doubt, a feeling of abandonment, or a final agonizing expression of his shared humanity? Not long after, Jesus of Nazareth was dead. The crucifixion of a messianic claimant was not an unusual event in first-century Judea. Rome used this brutal public method of execution precisely for its deterrent effect, to show the price of rebellion. For the followers of any executed leader, this was invariably the end of the story. Their hopes dashed, their leader publicly humiliated and proven powerless, the movement would typically dissolve, its members scattering back into obscurity. By all historical precedent, the story of Jesus of Nazareth should have ended with his final breath on Golgotha. The fact that it did not, that something happened in the days that followed, which utterly transformed his terrified, defeated disciples into the fearless founders of a global religion, is the central and most profound mystery of the Christian faith. What could possibly have turned the definitive end of their movement into its explosive beginning? According to the Christian tradition, the catalyst for this transformation was a series of astounding events that began on the third day. A wealthy and influential follower named Joseph of Arimathea, possibly a member of the Sanhedrin itself, obtained permission from Pontius Pilate to take Jesus' body down from the cross. assisted by a few of the female disciples who had remained faithful to the end, most notably Mary Magdalene. They hastily wrapped the body in linen and placed it in a new tomb carved out of rock. They sealed the entrance with a large stone, intending to return after the Sabbath had passed to perform the proper burial rites and anoint the body with spices. But when the women arrived at the tomb in the pre-dawn light of Sunday morning, they were met with a stunning sight. The heavy stone had been rolled away, and the tomb was empty. The Gospels offer slightly different accounts of what happened next. Some describe angels who announce the resurrection, others a direct encounter with the risen Jesus himself. But the core message is the same. He is not here. He has risen. How did this initial report from a small group of women, whose testimony was not even considered legally valid in that society, spark a belief that would conquer an empire? In the weeks that followed, this initial report was followed by a wave of alleged appearances of the resurrected Jesus to his disciples. He appeared to them in the upper room where they were hiding in fear, to 2 disciples walking on the road to Emmaus, and to the assembled apostles by the Sea of Galilee. These were not described as encounters with a ghost or a reanimated corpse. The resurrected Jesus was different, possessing a body that defied normal physical description. He could pass through locked doors, yet he could also eat fish and show them the wounds in his hands and side. The Apostle Paul, who never met the earthly Jesus but claims the resurrected Christ appeared to him in a blinding vision, described it as a spiritual body, distinct from our mortal flesh. It was these personal, transformative encounters, more than just the empty tomb, that convinced Jesus' followers of the unbelievable. Their master had not just been a prophet or a martyr, he had conquered death itself. Was this a series of collective hallucinations brought on by intense grief and messianic hope? Or was it a literal, historical event that fundamentally altered the laws of reality? This new, electrifying belief changed everything. The disciples, who had scattered in terror after Jesus' arrest, were re-energized and filled with a fearless conviction. 3 of them, Peter, the Rock, James, Jesus' brother, who had not been a follower during his lifetime, and John, the beloved disciple, emerged as the leaders of the fledgling movement in Jerusalem. They began to preach boldly in the very city that had executed their leader, reinterpreting his life and death through the lens of the resurrection. His crucifixion was no longer a shameful defeat. It was a cosmic sacrifice for the sins of humanity. His teachings were no longer just the wisdom of a great rabbi. They were the words of a divine being. They argued that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah, the Son of God, and that through his victory over death, he had inaugurated the kingdom of God and offered the promise of eternal life to all who believed. This was a message of such staggering audacity that it should have been laughed out of the city, yet it began to attract followers. Why did this seemingly insane message find fertile ground in the cynical, violent, and crowded streets of Jerusalem? A critical figure in this next chapter was a man who had been one of the movement's most ferocious enemies. Saul of Tarsus was a devout, Greek-speaking Pharisee who saw this new sect as a dangerous heresy and actively persecuted its members. But on the road to Damascus, he experienced a dramatic conversion, a vision of the resurrected Jesus that left him blind for 3 days. He emerged from this experience a changed man, adopting the Roman name Paul, and becoming the movement's most brilliant and tireless advocate. Paul's genius was to understand that this new faith could not remain a small, reformist sect within Judaism. He argued that the message of Christ's resurrection was universal, intended not just for Jews, but for all of humanity, the Gentiles. Within a remarkably short time, the early believers, now becoming known as Christians, largely abandoned their efforts to convince their fellow Jews and began a mission to spread their good news, the gospel, westward into the heart of the Roman Empire. How did this strategic shift from a Jewish messianic movement to a universal religion for the Gentile world set Christianity on a path to global dominance? The story of how a tiny, persecuted Jewish sect, founded by an executed provincial, managed to conquer the Roman Empire is one of the most improbable turnarounds in human history. In the decades following Jesus' death, his followers were a marginal and often misunderstood group. To the Roman authorities, they were at best a troublesome offshoot of Judaism. To many of their fellow Jews, they were dangerous heretics. They had no central authority, no sacred buildings, no political power, and their core belief that their crucified leader was a resurrected deity was ludicrous to the sophisticated Greco-Roman mind. Standing against them was the full might of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, an empire that had crushed kingdoms and assimilated gods with ruthless efficiency. How could this small flicker of faith, born in a forgotten corner of the Levant, possibly avoid being extinguished by the imperial machine? The initial spread was driven by the relentless energy of missionaries like the Apostle Paul. A Roman citizen himself, Paul brilliantly exploited the very infrastructure of the empire to spread a message that would ultimately subvert it. He traveled the famous Roman roads, communicated in Koine Greek, the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean, and targeted his preaching not to the countryside, but to the bustling, multicultural urban centers of the empire: Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, and eventually Rome itself. In these cities, he established small communities, or ecclesias, that became the nodes in a growing network. Through his constant letters, which would later form a huge portion of the New Testament, he shaped the theology, settled the disputes, and encouraged these fledgling churches. It was a strategy of decentralized viral growth, spreading from city to city, from port to port, along the arteries of Roman commerce and communication. What was it about this message that resonated so deeply with the diverse, often disenfranchised populations of these imperial cities? The answer lies in what Christianity offered that the traditional pagan religions did not. Roman paganism was largely a civic and transactional affair, a collection of rituals meant to ensure the prosperity and stability of the state and family. It offered little in the way of a personal relationship with the divine, scant comfort in the face of suffering, and a vague, shadowy conception of the afterlife. Christianity, by contrast, was intensely personal. It offered a God who loved humanity so much he had suffered and died for them. It promised forgiveness of sins, a direct relationship with the divine, and the hope of a glorious eternal life. Crucially, its community structure was radically inclusive. In the eyes of God, social distinctions were erased. Slave and free, Jew and Gentile, man and woman were all equal. The early church functioned as a powerful social safety net, caring for its widows, orphans, and poor in a way that was unheard of in the wider society. For the countless people living lives of quiet desperation at the bottom of the Roman social pyramid, this message of inherent dignity, community support, and cosmic hope was nothing short of revolutionary. Was this powerful social appeal, more than any miracle, the true engine of Christianity's astonishing growth? For the first few centuries, this growth took place under a cloud of suspicion and intermittently brutal persecution. As the Christians distinguished themselves from the Jews, they lost the legal protections Judaism had been granted. Their refusal to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods, and, most critically, to the divine spirit of the emperor, was not seen as a private religious conviction. It was seen as atheism and treason. It was a rejection of the very foundation of Roman society. While early persecutions, like the one under Nero, were often localized and opportunistic, by the mid-3rd century AD, the state saw the church's organized, empire-wide structure as a direct threat. Emperors like Decius and, most ferociously, Diocletian, in the Great Persecution of 303 AD, launched systematic state-sponsored campaigns to wipe Christianity out. They burned scriptures, destroyed churches, and demanded that all citizens sacrifice to the gods on pain of torture and death. But this policy of terror had the opposite of its intended effect. The courage of the martyrs who went to their deaths professing their faith became the church's most powerful recruitment tool. Why did the Roman strategy of violent suppression not only fail to crush the movement, but actually make it stronger? The final turning point came as the Roman Empire itself was entering a period of profound crisis. The 3rd century AD was a time of near-constant civil war, economic collapse, rampant plague, and barbarian invasions. The old certainties were crumbling. The traditional gods seemed powerless, and the empire was on the verge of disintegration. In this chaotic environment, the Christian Church, hardened and organized by persecution, appeared to be one of the only stable and growing institutions left. It was in this context that a general named Constantine, fighting for control of the empire, reportedly had a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky before a decisive battle, with the words, "In this sign, conquer." After his victory, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, which granted tolerance to all religions, effectively ending the persecution of Christians. A decade later, he was the sole ruler of the empire and began actively promoting Christianity, building lavish churches and giving its leaders positions of power. What had begun as a pragmatic political alliance with a powerful social movement soon became a full-blown transformation. Within a century of Diocletian's attempt to eradicate it, Christianity had become the official state religion of the Roman Empire. The old polytheistic faiths were now under attack, their temples closed, their followers persecuted. The tables had completely and astonishingly turned. How did the radical anti-establishment message of a crucified Galilean become the foundational ideology of the very empire that had executed him? Jesus Christ remains one of the most enigmatic figures in all of history. Unlike many characters from the Old Testament, whose very existence is debated by scholars, there is no serious historical doubt that a man named Jesus, or Yeshua, lived and was executed in 1st century Judea. He is referenced, however briefly, by non-Christian writers of the era like Josephus and Tacitus, grounding him firmly in the soil of historical reality. And yet, beyond this bare fact, almost everything else about his life is a complex interplay of history, memory, and theology. The person we can reconstruct through the critical lens of historical analysis is a faint sketch, a man born sometime around 4 BC, who grew up in the Galilean town of Nazareth and lived an uneventful life until he was about 30. He then began a brief but impactful ministry as a charismatic preacher, one of many who flourished in the turbulent religious landscape of Roman Judea. He gathered a small, dedicated following, and his radical message of social reversal and divine mercy ultimately antagonized the temple authorities in Jerusalem. After a deliberate confrontation during Passover week around the year 30 AD, they, in conjunction with the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, had him crucified. That is where the historical story ends and where the story of faith begins. Afterwards, his followers claimed that they had seen him risen from the dead, and this belief transformed them. They proclaimed that Jesus was not just a martyred prophet, but the Son of God, a divine being who was part of a Trinity with God the Father and the Holy Spirit. The story of Jesus after this point is really the story of the Church being born. One can argue that the shaping of his image to suit the designs of that embryonic church was achieved by carefully selecting which accounts of his life should be recounted and which should be discarded. The historical Jesus, the Aramaic-speaking Jewish reformer from Galilee, is incredibly difficult to tease apart from the Christ of faith, the divine figure who was curated and presented by the Greek-speaking church fathers in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. But despite this profound challenge, there is no denying the immense, world-altering significance of the man from Nazareth, whose life and teachings have shaped the course of nations, inspired countless acts of charity, and served as the foundation for the spiritual lives of billions, right down to the present day. What then do you think of Jesus? Was he the divine Son of God who willingly went to his death to save humanity? Or was he one of many Jewish messianic prophets, a mortal man whose radical message of social and spiritual reform was a direct reaction against the oppression of Roman rule and the corruption of the temple authorities in the 1st century AD?